Hey guys, welcome back. My name is Joe Ellis. I'm a commercial wedding and portrait photographer in Dallas, Texas, and also a dad. And this is another episode of Family Photo Life, which is all about helping parents make better photographs of their families and the people they love. So today I want to talk about one of the core tenets of photography. One of the things that is the most important to understand in terms of getting successful pictures, and that is your shutter speed. So I don't want to get too technical on this channel because I don't think that you need to have a bunch of technical knowledge. You just need to have enough to understand what's going on to make the photos that you want. So I'm going to explain these things. It's enough that we have got a basis of understanding for what they are, but then I really want to kind of base my tutorials and what I'm telling you guys around practical tips and applications. So I'm going to share today 5 times when as a parent you really need to understand what your camera is doing in terms of shutter speed. Okay, but first, let's back up and talk about what it is. So, in terms of controlling the light in your camera, there's kind of 4 parameters that we can control in terms of making pictures on your camera. One of them is your shutter speed. Okay, that is the gate inside the camera or the door inside the camera that opens and closes. It's what clicks when you take a photo, and it controls the amount of time that the camera's open to making an exposure. Okay, the second one is the aperture. That is the size of the opening in the lens that you've set. So inside every lens is a little diaphragm that can open and close, and of course the bigger the opening, the more light that gets in, and the smaller, the less light. The next one is called your ISO, and that is the sensitivity to light that your camera is using at that time. You can go in on your camera and you can make it more sensitive to light or less sensitive to light based on the conditions and where you're shooting. And the last one would be flash. We can control light that we're adding to the scene. So those are kind of the 4 parameters that we have control of as photographers. And I think that in terms of being a parent, that shutter speed is one of the most critical. So my daily driver is this beautiful little Olympus OMD EM10 Mark III. I call this camera my dad bod because this is the one that I take out when I'm taking pictures of my family. And there's just 2 things about this camera in particular, and Olympus cameras I think is really cool and relates to shutter speed. The first one is that you have what's called silent mode, okay? Silent mode in this camera. Normally, the shutter speed inside your camera is like a carbon fiber gate, like a mechanical shutter. Okay, you can actually hear it flip up and down, and that's what makes that click sound. What silent shutter does is it actually uses the sensor and turns on and off the sensor to make an exposure. So instead of the camera being open for a certain amount of time because the shutter is opening and closing, what's actually happening is it's just turning on and off, okay? What that means is that your camera is completely silent, and that is a huge benefit as a parent, okay? If your kids are sleeping and you want to get a photo of them, if you are in a situation where you're wanting to make photos at like a recital, for example, and you don't want to have to be a distraction to other people and you're taking photos, you can do it completely silently. To access silent mode on the EM10 Mark III, what you would do is go to the AP mode. Okay, so I've gone to my AP, my advanced modes, and this one here, and of course there's descriptions on each of these, but anytime you see a heart icon on an Olympus camera, the heart icon is for silent mode, okay? And so that is going to turn on that electronic shutter and give you the ability to make photos in absolute and complete silence. And I can't tell you what a benefit that is to me as a wedding photographer, but also as a parent in so many different situations. Just like the sea of parents that are next to you that are using their cell phones for making photos and they aren't making any noise, now you can do exactly the same thing. Instead of being that obnoxious mom or dad that's like bang, 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 bang. So, silent mode, absolutely amazing. If you have an EM10 Mark III, it's under the AP mode. If you have an EM5 Mark II or an EM1 Mark II, it's actually under the drive settings of your camera. So there you go. And then I just want to talk a little bit about shutter speeds in general, just to make sure that you guys understand something. Shutter speeds are actually fractions of a second. So in manual mode right here on my camera, let me center that up a little bit, you'll see that right now it says 400 here, and then it says f4.0. The f number is the aperture, the 400 is the shutter speed. And so as I roll this up and down, you can see that we're getting to 1/2000th of a second, 1/4000th of a second, so on and so forth. So it's just really important to know that when your camera's shutter is set to 125, that means that you're using a shutter speed of 1/200 or 1/125th of a second, okay? So that's how long the shutter will be open to take a photo. All right, so let's get on to the practical stuff now. So here are the 5 times when I am super hyper aware of what my shutter speed is. The first one is super simple, and that is action photos, okay? If you are taking pictures of sports, or in this case, our Mother's Day bike ride, the shutter speed is critical because I really want to have a tack sharp photo of the bikers or of my kids playing sports or whatever they are. So here's a couple of examples. The first one is of my kids just riding by on their bikes, and I have chosen a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. And at 1/1000th of a second, there's not enough time during the exposure for them to blur at all in the picture, okay? If you think about a photo, and here's another example of like a mistake in a way. Here's a photo of Nicholas where I took intentionally blurry, okay? In comparison to the first photograph, he's of course blurry, and they're sharp in the first one. In the blurry photograph, what happened is that this is a photo taken at like 1/30th or 1/60th of a second. And here's what happened. At the beginning of the exposure, when the camera first started to fire and it first opened up, he was in one position. At the end of the exposure, 1/30th of a second later, he was in another position. And so during the exposure, he was recorded in every single position between those two moments, okay? And so what you get as a result is a blur. Okay, now in the first photo at 1/1000th of a second, from where they are at the beginning of the exposure and where they are at the end of the exposure is so close together in time that of course there was no actual movement, and so what you get is a sharp photo. Okay, so that's what you have to pay attention to when you're shooting sports. You have to look at what you're shooting and try some shutter speeds and see at what number you're getting completely sharp action, okay? If you are shooting people walking at you, just from experience, I'll tell you that usually around 125th to a 250th of a second works out fine. If you are shooting something like soccer, where people are running and kicking and all that kind of good stuff, usually it's 1/500th to 1/1000th of a second works great. If you are shooting race cars, ripping around a corner, you might need a shutter speed higher than 1/1000th. You might need 1/2000th of a second to make sure that you get a super sharp wheel, for example, that's spinning at incredible speeds. So depending on your action, you have to understand what the camera's doing, what it's chosen, and if that's enough to stop your action. Now, my EM10 Mark III makes this a little bit easy on me. So if I go into the scene modes here on top of the camera, I get this, okay? And this is like a touch interface. And so there's lots of different options here, and a couple of these are just purpose-built for controlling shutter speeds. But the one I'm talking about right now is under the motion tab, okay? And if I pick motion, then I can pick the running icon, and that is for sports. And so what's going to happen if I choose that option is that my camera is going to work to maintain a high shutter speed, and above all other parameters, it's going to emphasize that I get a fast shutter so that I get sharp photos of my kids playing sports, okay? So that's really useful. But it's also useful to actually have the knowledge, because if the camera picked 1/500th and I'm out shooting motorsports, then I know that I might have to compensate for that by putting the camera into another mode. And one of those other modes is S, okay? So on almost every camera out there, you have S mode, okay? And that's right here, okay? And that's called shutter priority. And what shutter priority does is that it allows you to pick any shutter speed that you want, and the camera handles the rest of the equation, okay? So let's say you're out shooting soccer, and for whatever reason the scene mode in your camera is giving you a shutter speed that's not quite enough. You're like, oh man, there's still some blur in this picture. Then you would simply go to S mode, and then you'd pick a quicker shutter speed. And just to be clear, like if you're at 1/500th and you need a faster shutter, you got to go to 1/1000th. So that's a faster shutter, less time. Okay. So that's S mode, and then of course you have your scene modes. So the scene modes have been working great for me if I don't want to think about all that other stuff. So I would just go into the motion tab, and then I would pick the running icon. Okay, so let's look at a couple of other photos. First one I've already talked about, that's a soccer photo. This was taken at around 1/800th of a second. And of course, everybody in the frame is tack sharp, and it's just a beautiful soccer photo of my daughter. And I think every parent would love to take this kind of photo. And so the only other parameter that of course we have to control in these scenarios is making sure that we get sharp focus, which we'll talk about in another video. But assuming you get the picture in focus, if you choose a nice sharp, fast shutter speed, you're going to have a beautifully sharp photo. Okay, the next one is Taekwondo, okay? And Taekwondo is something my son's been doing now for about a year, and it represents a real challenge when it comes to taking photos, because not only is it fast action, it is also in low light, okay? So I have a lot to control in those scenarios, but in this case here, I've chosen 1/500th of a second, which makes sure that even though he's kicking and jumping and all that kind of good stuff, that I'm still getting a tack sharp photo. And this is the kind of thing that we expect and we want from our sports photos most of the time. And so, and then here's two other scenarios where shutter speed is kind of, or fast shutter speeds are actually really critical. Here's a photo of my kids playing in the sprinklers at summertime. And a lot of people love these kind of photos where water droplets are frozen in midair, because it really kind of highlights the feeling of summer, and it just kind of is cool to look at, right? And so when I shoot moving water, if I want it to be super, super frozen, then I usually choose a shutter speed of at least 1/1000th of a second. And so that's what I've done here. And you can see every little water droplet has been frozen in time, and it makes for a really cool picture. Okay, and this happens again in the wintertime, believe it or not. Here's a picture of the last time it snowed in Dallas. Doesn't happen that often, I know. But what happens to a lot of parents when they're out shooting like snow or rain, if they want to take like muddy puddle photos, for example, but in this case it's snow, is that if the shutter speed is a little bit too low, then the snow starts to blur. And what we really want is super sharp snowflakes. So this is another time when having a really fast shutter speed makes the photo that we really want to have, okay? So in this case, again, I think I was like 1/800th or 1/1000th of a second to make sure that the little tiny snowflakes were frozen in the air, and that really makes for a much more beautiful and interesting photo. Okay, so that's action. That's our first tip for shutter speed. Okay, the next one is low light, okay? And so my first example of kind of what I see coming from a lot of parents, and certainly what I see coming from a lot of cell phones, is a picture like this one, which was from the last Halloween that we had here. This is a picture of my daughter and her cousin kind of walking along the sidewalk after sunset, well after sunset, when the light is really beginning to dim down. And I was sort of following behind them taking photos. And in this case, I chose a shutter speed of 1/15th of a second. And at 1/15th of a second, you get a little bit of blur in the frame, okay? Now, while that doesn't ruin this photo for me, it certainly does, you know, kind of give it a softer look to the picture. So in scenarios when, like, let's say you're a new parent and you're chasing your kids around the house and they're doing all kinds of cute stuff inside the house, that is actually a very low light scenario for a camera. And so in that case, what I really need to do is set my camera up so that I have a high enough shutter speed to stop the action. So that might also require changing other settings, like giving yourself a higher ISO. But if I was going to shoot my 2-year-old running around the house, the way I would do it is that I would increase the ISO up to about 3200, and I would shoot at a shutter speed of at least 125th, if not 1/250th of a second. That would give me the best chance, I think, and the best compromise of settings to make sure that I get a sharp picture of, let's say, a running 2-year-old. Okay, so low light is another scenario when you really must control your shutter speed if you want to make sure you get sharp photos. The next one is flash, okay? And I don't want to get too far into this because this is a whole nother topic, but I want to give you 2 tips here, okay? The first one is that not everybody knows that when you put a flash on your camera, in the normal mode, in its most basic mode, your camera is going to have a maximum flash sync speed. And what that is the shutter speed, the highest shutter speed that it can use and still use the flash in the normal way is going to be around 1/250th of a second. Okay, you cannot go above, and most of the cameras will lock you out. It won't even allow you to choose shutter speeds that are faster than that. So just be aware of that. And we'll get into more of these flash specifics in another video. But the other thing I want to tell you about that I see from a lot of people when they're shooting their flash exposures is this. Let's say you want to take a photo at a party, okay? And so you put your flash on your camera and you're getting pretty good results. You're not terribly unhappy with what's going on. But one of the things that's bugging you is that the background of your photos, the things that are behind the people that you're taking pictures of with your flash, is turning out really dark. So you can't really see the party. You can't really see the room that you're in. It just winds up looking dark or black or, fairly dark. In those scenarios, what's happening is that the flash is doing the perfect job. It is illuminating the people in front of you in a perfect way. And so that's actually working as advertised. But if you want the background of your flash pictures to look more bright, if you want to see more of the room that's in the background, what you want to do is you want to lower your shutter speed down. By lowering your shutter speed from, let's say, 1/250th down to 1/30th, that's going to allow a lot more light from the background of the picture to show up in your actual photo. So that's my advice there. If you're having dark backgrounds in your flash exposures, lower your shutter speed down a little bit. Okay, and then the next thing I want to talk about, this one's maybe not too critical because my EM10 Mark III, for example, handles all of this automatically for me. But if I'm going to go into movie mode on my EM10 Mark III, one of the things that I can do is I can control the shutter speed and the aperture of my video. Now, if I'm shooting video and I'm controlling the exposure manually for whatever reason, because maybe it's a tricky lighting scenario or there's something that's bugging me, like for example, if you're at a recital and your child is spotlight on the stage and you have the camera set up to handle everything automatically, what might happen is that because the scene is relatively dark and your son or daughter is relatively bright, the camera might be having a hard time with that. So you might need to force it into a manual exposure mode so that you can control it. The thing about video is that the shutter speed needs to be twice the frame rate of your video. So on my EM10 Mark III, I can shoot video at 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. And I usually choose 24. So let's just say I'm shooting video at 4K resolution, which is the maximum quality setting I can get out of this camera, at 24 frames per second. If I do that, I need to choose a shutter speed that's either 1/48th, which is twice 24, or 1/50th, which is the closest shutter speed I can get. If I do that, what happens is that there's enough natural blur in every frame of the video for the motion of the video to look natural. 24 frames per second is sort of the movie standard, and so shooting at that shutter speed will give you very cinematic looking results. If you choose a shutter speed that's too high, what happens is that each frame of the video is too sharp, and as you play them, you see little stutters, because you're seeing every single frame as it's popping up instead of seeing a little bit of blur in each photo. So believe it or not, all video is intentionally a little bit blurry. So twice the frame rate for video. And then the last thing I'm going to show you guys here, 3 more photographs that are have to do with creative blur. Okay, so I went out on Mother's Day to go bike riding, and this was my primary intention, was to shoot a panning picture. And so if I go into my EM10 Mark III and I go back to that motion tab under the AP, under the scene mode. What am I doing? If you go into the scene modes and you go back to motion, one of the options here is this last little car with the blur on it. That's called panning mode. And so you can see that their example photo is a bike rider, and mine is too, okay? So in this case, what I've done is that I have taken a picture, and what's happening is that the camera is turning and moving so that it's tracking the subject as it's moving. So as Vivian's riding through the frame, I'm tracking her and keeping her in the exact same position in the picture. If I can match her speed exactly, what happens is that the camera thinks that she hasn't moved, because as we're moving during the exposure, she isn't moving in the frame. What's moving in the frame at that time is the background. So if I slow my shutter speed down to 1/15th of a second in this example, and I'm really careful and keep her in the same position and move with her at the same speed, then what happens is that she is rendered sharp and the background gets all this beautiful blur. And that is a panning photo. So if you're out practicing panning, a 1/15th of a second is a great place to start for a lot of things. And you're gonna have to take a lot of photos. The key skill that you have to have when you're panning is just learning to move at the same rate. And usually people try and move at the beginning a little too quickly. So really try and center the person in the frame if you can. Usually I don't try and do off-center compositions here because you're already working with quite a bit of technical stuff to kind of make it work. But your mileage may vary. I like to keep her in the center. And as I'm moving, I'm just trying to be very steady and very in sync with her movement. And then I fire off 2 or 3 frames as I'm going. And I'm hoping that one of those frames turns out to be where she is super sharp and the background is super blurry. So play around with shutter speeds, take a lot of photos, and of course we can review them on our cameras so it's easy to know if we got it in the bag. But that is panning. Okay, 2 more creative modes for shutter speed. Here's another photo of Taekwondo, and this is the most basic kind of creative shutter, and that is just using a slow shutter to actually allow blur in your photo. So in this case, they're kicking and punching and all that kind of good stuff, and I really feel like the slow shutter speed is adding a lot of ambiance and drama and feeling to the photo. To me, this picture of them with a slower shutter, like a 1/15 of a second, gives the viewer a better feeling of what it's like to be in the loud, fast-paced Taekwondo studio. So you can just sometimes use a slow shutter to give us a better feeling of what it was like to do something or be somewhere. Okay, and then the last one is an amazing mode in our Olympus cameras called Live Composite. In this case, I've got it's the 4th of July and I'm taking fireworks photos. And if I'm going to go, and again on my EM10 Mark III, this is again in the AP mode. And I have another whole video on this too, but let's just talk about it in terms of shutter speed. But here's Live Composite in the AP mode. In this case, what needs to happen is that I want the shutter open for a long enough duration of time for the fireworks, for multiple fireworks, to fire up into the air, burst, and then complete their run of color, okay? So that whole duration of time might be 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And so in this picture of my kids, I've done one other really tricky thing. I put them in front of the fireworks. I used the flash to shoot a picture where they were illuminated with the flash, okay? And in Live Composite mode, I do that on the first frame. And then in the second frame, it actually adds in 10, 15, 20 seconds of firework light, compositing it all together, giving me one combined frame where I not only get my kids illuminated in a nice way, I get beautiful fireworks. So that is another time when shutter speed is super critical. And of course the 4th of July is right around the corner. I think we should do another tutorial on just how to make that photo. But that's another time when creative shutter speed definitely made the day. So that's it, guys. Those are my 5 tips. Just to recap, it's really important to pay attention to your shutter speed during fast action, low light, video, flash exposures, and if you want to use it creatively. So those are 5 times when a parent really needs to pay attention to their shutter speed. I hope that's been of some help to you guys. We're going to go over each of these things in more detail probably in the future. And welcome to summer, you guys. I can't wait. Let's do this together. Hit me up with comments on YouTube, guys. Let's talk about it. You can find me pretty much everywhere at Family Photo Life, familyphotolife.com, and on Facebook and on Instagram. Talk to you in the next one. Bye.